So, in the last section, we mentioned that Georges Pompidou died in April of 1974, which meant that a new presidential election had to be called. So, France was going to go to the polls once more. But unlike the presidential election of 1969, which was somewhat haphazard in the sense that it was called quickly and there wasn't really too many serious candidates, the election of 1974 was to be one of the most tightly contested elections in French history. The old Socialist Party, the SFIO, the workers section the French section of the Workers' International, which had existed since the late 19th century, had done very badly in the presidential election of 1969. Its candidate only received less than 5% of the vote. And the Socialist Party's big problem was that the real party of energy on the French left was the Communist Party. But the problem for a lot of left voters was they felt that if they voted for the Socialist Party would inevitably have to depend upon the Communist Party in order to govern, and many French people didn't feel particularly comfortable about that. So we've come across Francois Mitterrand before. He'd been involved in French politics since the 1940s. He had run against de Gaulle as president in 1960, the first presidential election in 1965. And he decided that after the election in 1969, a new Socialist Party had to be created out of the old worker section or the old SFIO. And to that end, in 1971, he helped establish the Parti Socialiste, the Socialist Party, which took on some members of the old Socialist Party. But the big difference was it totally disavowed the actions of the Socialist Party from the 1950s, in which it had supported the Algerian War. The Algerian War and people's attitude towards it was still a major dividing issue in French society into the 1970s. And the Parti Socialiste was kind of shedding the association of the old Socialist Party with support for the Algerian War and appealing to the more, we talked about this term, the second left, the non-political party institutions of French society, and many people who were involved, of course, in the elections of May 1968 as well. The Communist Party also changed. Its old leader, Maurice Thorez, who had been very much a stooge for Stalin and had taken his orders directly from Moscow, he had died in the late 1960s, and by early 1970 a new political leader, Georges Marchais, who we've come across before, became the leader of the French Communist Party. And both Mitterrand and Marchais agreed to work together in trying to create a new popular front, essentially, or a new section of the French left that actually had a realistic chance of competing for government. And what this meant was that both Marchais and Mitterrand were due to run in the presidential election of 1974, but the kind of agreement was that if one of them didn't make it past the first round, they would encourage their supporters to support the other side. In particular, they were trying to collaborate on policies of nationalising more French industries and generally trying to remove the harsher effects of capitalism on French society. On the political right, there was also division. So de Gaulle's prime minister after the resignation of Pompidou was Jacques Chaban-Delmas, pictured here on the right. He was one of the kind of more senior figures in the Gaullist Party, and the Gaullist Party itself had kind of evolved to becoming one where the top politicians were those who had worked their way up the ladder, i.e. it didn't matter so much in terms of your own innovative abilities as a politician. You were expected to serve your time as a loyal adherent of the party before you could be put on a national platform. And so Chaban-Delmas was considered to have been have done this, having served as Chirac's, or having served as de Gaulle's prime minister. And this is what some people in French society called the baron system, that it was only the barons who had stuck around the party long enough, who had worked their way up, who had been unquestionably loyal to de Gaulle, who got to run for plum positions such as the president. His rival on the right was Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who we've come across before, who had been de Gaulle's finance minister for much of the 1960s, but who was actually much more economically liberal, I guess, than de Gaulle. Today we think of conservatism in the United States as meaning free market, supporters of free market policies. Giscard d'Estaing was a supporter of free market policies, whereas the traditional Gaullist method was the French economy had to involve itself in the economy in terms of planning it and making sure that French industry was working towards a national interest. And so that was the kind of division between them. He was not considered for that reason a kind of loyal de Gaullist. In fact, he had opposed de Gaulle's referendum in 1969 that led to de Gaulle's resignation. So there's a split on the French right between Chaban Delmas, who was the loyal supporter of de Gaulle, and Giscard d'Estaing, who had been something of a maverick, and whose policies, while broadly on the right of French society, were kind of not necessarily strictly in the traditional Gaullist tradition. So round one. So 12 people ran for the French presidency in 1974. If you remember, we talked about this in a previous lecture, that under the presidential system of the Fifth Republic, if no candidate won more than 50% of the votes, there would be a runoff between the top two candidates from the first round. So round one. Here we have the various candidates. I mean, the really important ones are the three we've mentioned: Mitterrand, Giscard d'Estaing, and Delmas. And what we see here is that Mitterrand actually gets the most votes. He gets almost 44% of the vote, but he doesn't get an overall majority. And then the vote of the French political right is split between Giscard d'Estaing and Chaban Delmas. But it's clearly Giscard d'Estaing who has appealed to more French voters. So we are going to have round two. And in round two, it's basically Mitterrand against Giscard d'Estaing. There was a famous presidential debate pictured here between the two men, in which Giscard d'Estaing accused Mitterrand of being a man of the past. So Giscard d'Estaing himself was, I mean, you guys won't consider 48 to be well young, but certainly compared to de Gaulle, was pretty young, and is one of the youngest French presidents in history. He called Mitterrand, who had been around the political scene since the 1940s, a man of the past. And instead he was promising change. Giscard d'Estaing's greatest policy was, or his promise was, an advanced liberal society, that French society needs more, on the one hand, economic liberalism, that is removal of the government from the market, but also needs to kind of break away from the more kind of conservative elements of de Gaulle's control of French society. So in the end, it's a very closely run race. You can see here that even though Mitterrand was able to increase his share of the vote in the second round, he falls short of 50%, and Giscard d'Estaing just gets in ahead of him and becomes France's third president under the system of the Fifth Republic. And so Giscard d'Estaing himself described himself as a conservative who likes change. So unlike Pompidou, who had been kind of somewhat conservative and not really sought to dramatically change French society too much, Giscard d'Estaing wasn't promising revolutionary change, but he did feel there was important aspects of French society in which new policies could make a significant difference to the lives of ordinary people. So one of these, a constitutional question for you guys. So the 26th Amendment, introduced in 1971, guaranteed this. And as good American citizens, I assume you guys all know that it made the voting age 18 in the United States. And so Giscard d'Estaing introduces something very similar in France pretty soon after becoming president. So the old enough to vote, old enough to fight, old enough to vote. These were the campaign badges from the United States campaign for the 26th Amendment. But France has something very similar shortly thereafter. Giscard d'Estaing also he didn't create the Constitutional Council, but he changed the rules of it. So the Constitutional Council existed that if someone wanted to test the legality of a law, they could refer to the Constitutional Council, which was made up of the leading jurists in France. The problem was only the president or the prime minister could refer legislation to the council, which meant that it really wasn't able to. It was really only the government itself could check the constitutionality of its own laws, and in that sense didn't really make an awful lot of sense. But Giscard d'Estaing changed it so that if any 60 deputies of the National Assembly wanted it to be the legality of something to be checked, they could send it to the Council of the Constitutional Council, and that for the first time in a long time was the creation of the French judicial branch of government as a genuinely independent force that had some kind of influence on French laws. Because in the past, really, once laws were passed, unless the Constitutional Council was specifically asked to refer the constitutionality of something, there wasn't much the judicial branch could do. Giscard d'Estaing had also sought to win female votes by promising to respect the growing feminist movement that had emerged in France in the early 1970s, and of course as part of the second wave of feminism that we see kind of rising around much of the Western world at this time period. He promoted Simone Veil, made her the Minister for Health, the first ever woman to serve as a full minister in the French government. She herself was actually not from a particularly feminist background at all, but he felt this was an important gesture towards recognizing the demands of feminists for change in French society. And the Giscard d'Estaing government also introduced 3 significant changes that were important demands of feminists. 1. Greater access to birth control. Birth control access had been pretty limited in France since the 1920s. 2. Divorce had been legal in France. It was difficult to obtain. The laws became more liberal, making it essentially easier to get divorce. And 3, the most controversial of this, the proposal to legalize abortion in France. And of course, this is taking place in the context of Roe v. Wade ruling in the United States in 1973. And this law was not surprisingly the most controversial of the laws. It was the first law actually referred to the new the change system of the Constitutional Council, but became law in France in 1975. Abortion became legal in France in that year. Giscard d'Estaing also became active in the European Union. He encouraged France and its allies to create something called the European Monetary System. What that basically meant was that the currencies of most of the major European countries, apart from the United Kingdom, were linked together, which facilitated trade across borders because fluctuating currencies you didn't have to check the price of your currency every day if you were selling across a border, because the rise and fall of these currencies now became linked and became much more stable. He also oversaw or approved the introduction of of a directly elected European Parliament. So the Parliament had existed prior to Giscard d'Estaing becoming president, but it was decided that starting from 1979 onwards, there would be direct elections to the French Parliament, or to the European Parliament. Giscard d'Estaing continued to encourage French involvement in its former colonies, and oftentimes this meant selling weapons to former colonies, which was good business for French arms industry, but kind of raised questions about France's commitment to world peace, and it's what kind of, was it necessarily an agent of good on the world stage. Giscard d'Estaing also became involved in a controversy. Let me just get my notes 1 second. In 1970, well, the controversy itself developed in 1979, but in response to events of 1973, where it was discovered that so the Central African Republic had been a French colony that had become independent in 1960, and here is Giscard d'Estaing with the president of Central African Republic, or essentially the dictator, who was Jean Bedel Bokassa. He had given Giscard d'Estaing 2 diamonds in 1973. This became public knowledge in 1979, and a lot of people became concerned that Giscard d'Estaing had been favouring the Central African Republic in terms of their policies in return for a greater I'm sorry, the exact way of saying it. In return for basically giving political support and loyalty and undue support to the Central African Republic. So what we see is that Giscard d'Estaing tries to introduce considerable reforms, and in the beginning there's a lot of sense of people that important changes being made, but by the end of his reign there is a growing concern about corruption, or kind of a general sense of stagnation within his administration in particular, and as we'll see more in a second, because France faces considerable difficulties on the economic front.